It was early 1994 when I found myself staring at a map, wondering how I got here. My name's Tanner Ridgway, and I was a carpenter by trade, but after a series of bad jobs and worse bosses, I decided I needed a break from the chaos of city life. A friend mentioned an old family cabin up in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, unused for years, and it seemed like the perfect getaway to clear my head. I'd always been a hands-on kind of guy, able to fix just about anything with wood and nails, but the truth is, I was running away from a mess I didn't know how to fix. Divorce papers, unpaid bills, and a life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. The cabin was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to stop the spiral and rebuild. I didn't expect it to be where I'd face something I couldn't fix with a hammer. The decision to leave hadn't come easily. For weeks I'd been drowning in a sea of self-pity and cheap whiskey, watching as my life unraveled thread by thread. It started with the argument, the last in a long line of them, with my soon-to-be ex-wife Sarah. "You're never here, Tanner," she'd screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "Even when you are, you're not really present. It's like living with a ghost." I remember standing there, my work boots tracking sawdust across the kitchen floor she'd just cleaned. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down I knew she was right. Our marriage had been on the rocks for years. We'd met young, fell hard, and got married before either of us really knew who we were. For a while it worked. We were happy, or at least we thought we were. But as the years went by, the cracks started to show. I threw myself into my work, taking on more projects, staying later at job sites, anything to avoid coming home to the silence that had settled between us. Sarah tried, God knows she tried, to bridge the gap. But I was too stubborn, too set in my ways to meet her halfway. The night she handed me the divorce papers, I didn't even flinch. It was like I'd been expecting it, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I signed them without a word, packed a bag, and checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. For days I wandered in a haze, showing up to work on autopilot, my mind a million miles away. It was during one of these fog-filled days that I managed to royally screw up a job, misreading the blueprints and building an entire wall in the wrong place. My boss, a red-faced man named Frank, who'd always had it out for me, didn't hold back. "Ridgway," he bellowed, his face inches from mine. "You just cost us a week's worth of work and materials. What the hell were you thinking?" I stood there, taking the verbal lashing, my fists clenched at my sides, and then something inside me snapped. "You know what, Frank?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "I quit." I walked off the job site, ignoring the chorus of shouts behind me. It felt good, for about 5 minutes. Then the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. No job, no wife, no home to speak of. I was adrift, untethered from everything that had once defined me. That's when I remembered the cabin. Years ago, my buddy Mike had mentioned it in passing, an old family property, tucked away in the Ouachita Mountains. "It's a bit rough," he'd said, "but it's there if you ever need to get away." I called Mike that night, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. "Mike, it's Tanner. Remember that cabin you mentioned? Is it still available?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he might say no. But then I heard him sigh. "Yeah, it's available. But Tanner, are you sure? It's pretty isolated up there." I almost laughed. Isolated was exactly what I needed. "I'm sure," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "I just need some time to clear my head, you know." Mike was quiet for a moment, and I could almost see him running his hand through his hair, a habit he'd had since we were kids. "All right," he finally said. "I'll text you the directions. But Tanner, be careful up there, it's different." I thanked him, promising to check in regularly, and hung up. As I packed my truck with what little I owned, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. This was it, my chance to start over, to find myself again. Little did I know, what I'd find in those mountains would change me forever, in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. The drive to the Ouachita Mountains was long and winding, taking me through stretches of Arkansas I'd never seen before. As the cityscape faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and dense forests, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The further I got from my old life, the easier it became to breathe. I'd left early in the morning, the sky still tinged with the pink and orange hues of dawn. My old pickup truck, a '78 Ford that had seen better days, groaned in protest as I pushed it up steep inclines. but it held together just like it always had. The radio faded in and out as I drove, catching snatches of country music and talk shows. Eventually, I gave up and popped in an old Johnny Cash cassette. As I walked the line filled the cab, I found myself humming along, my fingers tapping against the steering wheel. It was mid-afternoon when I finally reached the turnoff Mike had described. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to little more than a dirt path. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck. I checked the hastily scribbled directions on the crumpled piece of paper beside me, squinting to make out Mike's chicken scratch handwriting. Left at the big oak with the split trunk, it read. I scanned the woods, my eyes peeled for anything resembling the landmark. Just as I was beginning to think I'd missed it, the trees parted, revealing a massive oak. Its trunk was indeed split, as if it had been struck by lightning long ago. I made the turn, the truck bouncing over exposed roots and rocks. The path narrowed even further, to the point where I was sure I'd have to get out and walk the rest of the way. But then suddenly, the trees gave way to a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. My first thought was that Mike had undersold just how rough the place was. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades, not just a few years. The roof had partially caved in on one side, the windows were so grimy I couldn't see through them, and the front door hung at an awkward angle, its hinges rusted and bent. For a moment I sat in the truck, staring at the dilapidated structure. A part of me wanted to turn around, to head back to civilization and figure out another plan. But then I remembered what I was running from, the failed marriage, the lost job, the mountain of debt. At least here I had a purpose. I could fix this place up, make it livable. It was something tangible, something I could control. I killed the engine and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was different here, crisp and clean, with a hint of pine. I took a deep breath, feeling it fill my lungs. As I approached the cabin, I could hear the soft creaking of wood, the structure settling in the afternoon heat. Up close, I could see that the damage wasn't as bad as it had first appeared. The roof would need work, sure, and the windows would have to be replaced, but the foundation looked solid, and most of the walls were intact. I reached out, running my hand along the rough-hewn logs that made up the cabin's exterior. Despite the years of neglect, there was something solid about it, something that had weathered the test of time. "All right," I muttered to myself, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Let's see what we're working with here." I made my way to the front door, giving it a gentle push. It groaned in protest, but swung open, revealing the cabin's interior. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the holes in the roof. The floor was littered with leaves and debris that had blown in over the years. But beneath the layer of grime and neglect I could see the bones of something beautiful. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, and a ladder led up to a loft area that I assumed served as the bedroom. I spent the next hour exploring, taking mental notes of what needed to be fixed and what could be salvaged. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. I headed back to the truck, retrieving my sleeping bag and a cooler filled with supplies. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As I unrolled the sleeping bag on the dusty floor, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Sarah, or the divorce, or the mess I'd left behind. Here, in this rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere, I had a clean slate, a chance to rebuild, not just the cabin, but myself. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the sounds of the forest surrounding me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Little did I know that hope would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The next few days fell into a rhythm, a pattern of work and solitude that I found oddly comforting. I'd wake at dawn, the sunlight filtering through the gaps in the roof serving as my alarm clock. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, I'd set to work. The first order of business was the roof. I'd brought along some basic tools and supplies, enough to patch the worst of the damage. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it would keep the rain out until I could do a proper job. As I worked, I found myself talking out loud, narrating my actions as if I were teaching an invisible apprentice. It was a habit I'd picked up years ago on job sites, a way to organize my thoughts and stay focused. "All right, we've got a rotted beam here," I'd mutter, running my hand along the splintered wood. Need to cut it out and replace it. Measure twice, cut once. The physical labor was therapeutic. With each nail I drove, each shingle I replaced, I felt like I was rebuilding more than just the cabin. I was piecing myself back together, bit by bit. During breaks I'd explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but beyond that the forest stretched out in every direction. Towering pines and old-growth hardwoods created a canopy overhead, dappling the forest floor with patches of sunlight. I discovered a small stream about a quarter-mile from the cabin, its clear water bubbling over smooth rocks. It was here that I'd sit during the hottest part of the day, letting the cool mist from the water refresh me. One afternoon, as I was making my way back to the cabin, I stumbled upon an old shed I hadn't noticed before. It was half hidden by overgrown vines and bushes, its weathered wood blending in with the surrounding trees. Curious, I pushed aside the foliage and pried open the rusted door. The hinges groaned in protest, and for a moment I thought they might give way entirely. But they held, revealing the shed's interior. It was like stepping back in time. The small space was crammed with tools and equipment, most of it decades old. Rusty saws hung from pegs on the wall, their teeth dulled with age. An old workbench stood against one wall, its surface scarred and stained. But it was what I found in the corner that really caught my attention. Tucked away behind some old crates was a hunting rifle, its stock smooth and well-oiled despite the years of disuse. Next to it sat a box of ammunition, the cardboard faded but still intact. I picked up the rifle, feeling its weight in my hands. I'd never been much of a hunter, but I knew how to handle a gun. My dad had taught me the basics when I was a kid, emphasizing safety above all else. Always treat it like it's loaded. His voice echoed in my head as I checked the chamber. It was empty, as I'd expected, but I still felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach. I debated whether to bring the rifle back to the cabin. On one hand, it might come in handy. There were bound to be animals in these woods, and while I had no intention of hunting, the idea of having some protection was appealing. On the other hand, the thought of having a loaded weapon around made me uneasy. In the end, I decided to leave it where it was. I could always come back for it if I needed to. I made a mental note of its location and headed back to the cabin, my mind already turning to the next repair on my list. As the days passed, I fell into a routine. Work during the day, a simple dinner as the sun set, and then evenings spent sitting on the newly repaired porch, watching as the forest came alive with nocturnal sounds. It was during one of these evenings, about a week into my stay, that I first noticed something off. I was sitting in an old rocking chair I'd found in the cabin, nursing a cup of instant coffee, when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. I sat up straighter, my eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. For a moment all was still. Then, from the dense tree line, I caught movement. At first I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move right. The way it shifted between the trees, low and slow, felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. Whatever it was big, much larger than any deer I'd ever seen, and it didn't seem to care that I was there. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee mug down on the porch railing. My heart was pounding, a steady drumbeat in my ears. I took a step towards the edge of the porch, squinting into the darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the movement stopped. The forest fell silent, an unnatural hush descending over the clearing. Even the crickets had stopped their nightly chorus. I stood there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something. But nothing came. Eventually, the normal sounds of the night resumed, as if someone had flipped a switch. I retreated back into the cabin, double-checking that I'd locked the door behind me. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Probably just a bear or a large deer, nothing to worry about. But as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Something wasn't right in these woods. And I had a feeling I was about to find out what it was. The next few days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since that night on the porch. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor, as if keeping busy could somehow keep whatever was out there at bay. I focused on the interior of the cabin, scrubbing years of grime from the windows and floors. As I worked, I couldn't help but wonder about the cabin's history. Who had built it? Why had they abandoned it? The more I cleaned, the more traces of its past inhabitants I uncovered. A child's drawing tucked behind a loose floorboard, an old locket hidden in the back of a drawer. These glimpses into the lives of those who had come before me were a welcome distraction from my own troubled thoughts. I found myself creating stories about them in my mind, imagining their lives and the reasons they might have left this place behind. But as night fell, my unease would return. I'd find myself sitting on the porch, straining my eyes against the darkness, searching for any sign of movement in the tree line. More often than not, I'd see nothing. But sometimes, just on the edge of my vision, I'd catch a flicker of something, a shadow moving against shadows, there and gone, so quickly I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. It was on the third night after my initial sighting that things took a turn. I was outside, sharpening some old tools I'd found in the shed. The repetitive motion was soothing, and I'd lost track of time, the sun long since dipped below the horizon. That's when I heard it, a rustling that was too deliberate to be the wind. I paused, my hand frozen mid-stroke on the whetstone. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from the dense tree line, I caught movement. At first I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move right. The way it shifted between the trees, low and slow, felt wrong. Whatever it was big, much larger than any deer I'd ever seen, and it didn't seem to care that I was there. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I aimed the light at the tree line, the beam slicing through the thick Arkansas night. For a moment, nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the cabin, I saw it. A shape hunched low to the ground, covered in a matted dark coat that almost looked like it had patches of skin exposed. It wasn't a bear, that much I knew. The shoulders were too pronounced, too sharp, and it moved in a way that reminded me of a giant, hairless wolf. It looked right at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. I wasn't sure it had any. I backed up slowly, the light from my flashlight shaking as my hand trembled. I wasn't armed, except for the old hatchet I'd been using for firewood, which lay uselessly near the chopping block. The creature, or whatever it was, sniffed the air like it was testing for something. Then, to my horror, it took a step forward, emerging fully from the tree line. In the harsh beam of my flashlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It stood on all fours, but its front legs were unnaturally long, ending in what looked like hands rather than paws. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and exposed flesh, as if it were molting, but it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was almost human, but grotesquely elongated, with a jaw that hung open to reveal row upon row of needle-like teeth. Where its eyes should have been, there were only sunken hollows, dark and empty. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the light, anything but what I was seeing. The creature's head snapped towards me at the sound of my movement. It let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted for the cabin as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its bizarre gait producing a rhythmic thudding that spurred me on. I reached the cabin door, fumbling with the handle in my panic. Just as I felt it give way, something slammed into my back, sending me sprawling into the cabin. I rolled, coming face to face with the creature as it loomed in the doorway. For a moment we stared at each other, me, gasping for breath on the floor, and this impossible thing poised to strike. Then, inexplicably, it hesitated, its head tilted to the side, almost quizzically, and it sniffed the air again. Taking advantage of its momentary pause, I scrambled to my feet and slammed the door shut, throwing my weight against it. I half expected the creature to burst through, to tear the door from its hinges with ease. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Gradually, the sound of my own ragged breathing subsided, and I became aware of the silence outside. No scratching at the door, no inhuman noises, nothing. Cautiously, I peered out the window. The clearing was empty, bathed in moonlight. Whatever that thing was, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the door, the hatchet clutched in my sweating palms, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax, if only a little. What had I seen? The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of it, to fit it into some category of known animals, but I knew deep down that what I'd encountered was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. As I watched the sun rise, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay here. Whatever was in these woods, I didn't want to meet it again. But things never go as planned, do they? Despite my resolve to leave, I found myself paralyzed by indecision as the day wore on. The encounter from the night before seemed almost dreamlike in the harsh light of day, and I began to doubt my own memories. Had it really happened, or was my mind, stressed and isolated, playing tricks on me? I spent the morning pacing the cabin, alternating between packing my belongings and unpacking them, unable to commit to a course of action. By midday, I had convinced myself that staying one more night wouldn't hurt. I'd be extra vigilant, I told myself, and if nothing happened, I'd leave first thing in the morning. To distract myself from my churning thoughts, I decided to finish the repairs I'd started on the roof. Physical labor had always been my way of coping with stress, and I hoped it would provide some clarity. I was up on the roof, hammering the last few nails into a set of new shingles I'd put up, when I heard it again. Only this time it wasn't rustling. It was a low, drawn-out sound, like something dragging itself through the brush. I froze, every hair on my body standing up. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the edge of the roof, peering down at the forest below. That's when I saw it again, closer this time, dragging something behind it. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. It was a man, or at least what was left of him. His body was mangled, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and his face, what was left of his face, was contorted in terror. I gagged, feeling bile rise in my throat, but forced myself to stay still. The creature dropped the man's body and sniffed the air again, like it knew I was watching. It didn't seem to care. It started tearing into the man's chest with its long, claw-like fingers, too precise for a wild animal, almost like it was dissecting him. Blood soaked the ground, and the noise it made while feeding was wet, sickening. I backed up, one step at a time, until I reached the ladder I'd used to climb up. My foot hit the top rung, and the old wood creaked loudly. The creature stopped. Its head snapped up, and though I still couldn't make out any eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. For a moment we were frozen in a tableau of horror, me, halfway down the ladder, and the creature, its hands deep in the corpse's chest cavity. Then, with a speed that defied its awkward shape, it began to move towards the cabin. I scrambled down the ladder, my feet barely touching the rungs as I half climbed, half fell to the ground. I hit the earth running, bolting for the cabin door. I could hear it behind me, its bizarre gait producing that same rhythmic thudding I remembered from the night before. I reached the door, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. I slammed it shut and barred it with the nearest piece of furniture I could find, an old heavy dresser. My mind raced. I had no phone, no way to call for help. My only weapon was the hatchet, but going up against whatever that thing was seemed like a death sentence. I scanned the room for anything else useful. A hunting rifle, anything. But the cabin was barren. Then I remembered, the rifle in the shed. It was my only chance. But to get to it I'd have to go outside, to run past that thing. The very thought made my knees weak. A loud thud against the door jolted me from my thoughts. The dresser shuddered, sliding a few inches across the floor. Another thud, and I could see the wood of the door beginning to splinter. I was out of time and out of options. I gripped the hatchet tightly, my palms slick with sweat. As the creature slammed into the door again, I made my decision. I'd make a run for the shed. It was my only chance. I positioned myself by the back door, my hand on the knob. I could hear the creature still battering at the front of the cabin, the sound of splintering wood growing louder with each impact. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. With one final violent crash, the front door gave way. I yanked open the back door and ran, not daring to look behind me. I could hear the creature's surprised screech, followed by the sound of it scrambling to change direction. The shed seemed miles away, though I knew it was only a short distance. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed on, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. I reached the shed, practically ripping the door off its hinges in my haste to get inside. My eyes darted around frantically, searching for the rifle. Where was it? Where had I seen it? Behind me, I could hear the creature approaching, its strange gait unmistakable. My hands scrabbled through old boxes, tossing aside rusted tools and moldy books. Where was the damn rifle? And then, miraculously, my hand closed around the smooth wooden stock. I yanked it free from its hiding place, fumbling to load it with the ammunition I'd found nearby. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it, but somehow I got the rounds in. I turned just as the creature reached the shed door. It filled the entrance completely, its misshapen body blocking out the light. For a moment we stared at each other, a twisted mirror of our encounter the night before. Then, slowly, deliberately, I raised the rifle. The creature cocked its head, as if curious about this new development. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the shed. The creature staggered backward, a dark stain spreading across its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the shed. I fired again and again, each shot driving the creature back a step. But it kept coming, seemingly impervious to the bullets tearing through its flesh. I was down to my last round, my back pressed against the far wall of the shed. As I raised the rifle for one final shot, the creature suddenly stopped. It stood there, swaying slightly, its chest a mess of bullet holes and dark viscous fluid. Then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. The sound it made was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a guttural, rasping noise that somehow formed words. "Not yours," it said, the words barely intelligible. "This place, not yours." Before I could process what I'd heard, the creature turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the forest with surprising speed. I stood there, the rifle still raised, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't until the sun began to set that I finally moved, my muscles stiff and aching. I made my way back to the cabin on shaky legs, my mind reeling. What had the creature meant? What was this place? As I approached the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Carved into one of the logs near the door was a symbol, a complex, swirling design that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked at it. I had a feeling that my time in these mountains was far from over. Whatever secrets this place held, whatever that creature was, I knew I couldn't leave until I uncovered the truth. As night fell, I barricaded myself in the cabin once more, the rifle close at hand. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something far beyond my understanding. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that discovery might mean. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic research and mounting paranoia. I couldn't shake the memory of the creature's words, nor the image of that strange symbol carved into the cabin. There was more to this place than met the eye, and I was determined to uncover its secrets. I started by thoroughly searching the cabin, looking for any clues its previous inhabitants might have left behind. I pried up floorboards, checked behind every loose panel, and combed through the few pieces of furniture that remained. My search yielded little at first, a few old newspapers, some faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. But then, hidden in a small compartment beneath a loose brick in the fireplace, I found something. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped, spidery handwriting that was difficult to decipher. I spent hours poring over the journal, piecing together its contents. It had belonged to a man named Elias Blackwood, who had lived in the cabin in the 1930s. Elias wrote of strange occurrences in the forest, of creatures that defied explanation, and nights filled with unearthly sounds. But more than that, he wrote of a cult, a group that had inhabited these mountains long before white settlers arrived, practicing rituals that Elias described as an abomination against nature and God alike. According to the journal, the cult had discovered a way to bend reality itself, to create creatures that existed between worlds. The symbol I had seen on the cabin was their mark, a ward meant to protect against the very things they had created. But something had gone wrong. The creatures had turned on their masters, driving them from the mountains. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. Could it be true? It seemed impossible, the ravings of a madman, and yet after what I had seen, could I really discount it? The final pages of the journal were filled with frantic scribblings, diagrams of the symbol I had seen, and warnings. "They're coming," Elias had written, the words pressed so hard into the page that they had nearly torn through. "God help me, they're coming." The journal ended there, leaving me with more questions than answers. What had happened to Elias? Had the creatures gotten him, or had he fled, like so many others who had tried to make a home in these cursed mountains? I spent the next few days in a research frenzy, making trips into the nearest town to use the library's internet connection. I searched for any information I could find on the history of the area, on disappearances or strange sightings in the Ouachita Mountains. What I found was disturbing. Over the years, dozens of people had gone missing in these woods. Hikers, campers, even entire families, vanishing without a trace. The official reports blamed it on the terrain, on wild animals or simple misadventure. But I knew better now. I also found scattered references to the cult Elias had mentioned. Nothing concrete, just whispers and rumors on obscure forums and in old dusty books. But it was enough to convince me that I was on the right track. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to notice things. Small things at first. The way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The eerie silence that would sometimes fall over the forest, as if every living thing was holding its breath. And then there were the dreams. Every night I found myself wandering through misty, otherworldly landscapes pursued by shapes I couldn't quite see. I would wake gasping, the bedsheets tangled around me. The symbol from the cabin burned into my mind's eye. As the days wore on, I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The line between waking and dreaming became blurred. More than once I caught myself sleepwalking, only coming to my senses when I found myself standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the depths of the forest. It was during one of these episodes that I made a chilling discovery. I had wandered further into the woods than ever before, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. As I came to my senses, I realized I was standing in a small circular clearing I had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered. Its surface was carved with the same swirling symbol I had seen on the cabin, only larger and more complex. Around the altar, the ground was littered with bones, some animal, some disturbingly human. I approached the altar cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed something else. Carved into the stone, barely visible beneath years of moss and lichen, were words in a language I didn't recognize. I reached out, my fingers tracing the alien script. As I did, I felt a jolt, like static electricity run through my body, and suddenly, impossibly, I could understand the words. "The gate stands open," they read. "The worlds bleed together. What was sundered shall be whole again." As the meaning of the words sank in, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, its misshapen form silhouetted against the trees. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, I could see other shapes moving in the shadows, things that defied description. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear them behind me, their unearthly cries echoing through the trees. Somehow, I made it back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the locks. As I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, I realized something that turned my blood to ice. They hadn't followed me. They could have easily overtaken me, but they had stopped at the edge of the clearing. It was as if they were waiting for something. That night, as I huddled in the cabin, the rifle clutched to my chest, I knew I had to leave. Whatever was happening in these mountains, whatever dark forces were at work, it was bigger than me. I needed help. But as I packed my meager belongings, a thought nagged at me. The symbol on the cabin had protected me so far. If I left, what would happen? Would the creatures be free to roam beyond the boundaries of the forest? Was I the only thing standing between them and the unsuspecting world beyond? I stood at the cabin door, my hand on the knob, torn between self-preservation and a sense of responsibility I didn't fully understand. And that's when I heard it, a sound that made my decision for me. From somewhere in the forest came a scream. A human scream. Without thinking, I grabbed the rifle and ran out into the night. The scream had come from the direction of the stone altar, and I found myself retracing my steps from earlier that day. As I approached the clearing, I could hear voices, human voices, mixed with the inhuman sounds of the creatures. I slowed, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. The scene that greeted me in the clearing was like something out of a nightmare. A group of people dressed in dark robes stood around the altar. In their midst was a young woman, struggling against the ropes that bound her. And surrounding them all were the creatures, Dozens of them, more than I had ever seen before. They formed a circle around the clearing, their misshapen bodies swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen wind. I watched in horror as one of the robed figures raised a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. The chanting grew louder, reaching a fevered pitch. I knew I had to act. But what could I do against so many? I was just one man with a rifle, facing down forces I barely understood. Then I remembered the words on the altar. The gate stands open. This wasn't just a ritual. It was an opening, a tearing of the veil between worlds. And somehow I knew that I was meant to close it. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the clearing. "Stop," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Everyone, human and creature alike, turned to look at me. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then one of the robed figures spoke. "Who dares interrupt the great joining?" I raised the rifle, aiming it at the figure with the knife. "Someone who's seen enough to know this needs to end," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, outsider. We stand on the brink of a new age. The old ones will return, and we shall be their heralds." As he spoke, I noticed something. The creatures were watching me intently, their eyeless faces turned in my direction. They seemed expectant. And suddenly, I understood. They hadn't been created by the cult. They were victims, twisted and changed by the dark rituals performed here. And they were waiting for someone to end their torment. With a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks, I knew what I had to do. I turned the rifle towards the altar and fired. The bullet struck the ancient stone, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world tearing apart, a crack appeared in the altar's surface. The cultists cried out in alarm, but their voices were drowned out by the screeching of the creatures. As I watched, the crack in the altar widened, spreading across its surface like a spider's web. The air itself seemed to ripple, reality bending and warping around us. The cultists tried to run, but the creatures were faster. They fell upon their former masters with a vengeance born of years of torment. I rushed to the young woman, cutting her free from her bonds. "Run," I yelled, pushing her towards the edge of the clearing. She didn't need to be told twice. As she disappeared into the trees, I turned back to the scene of chaos before me. The altar was crumbling, pieces of stone falling away to reveal a swirling vortex of darkness beneath. The creatures were being pulled towards it, their bodies twisting and dissolving as they were sucked in. Their cries changed from rage to what sounded almost like relief. I felt the pull of the vortex myself, my feet sliding across the ground towards it. I grabbed onto a nearby tree, holding on for dear life as the wind howled around me. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The vortex collapsed in on itself with a thunderous boom, leaving behind nothing but a smoking crater where the altar had stood. The clearing was empty, the cultists, the creatures, all gone. Only I remained, clinging to the tree, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made my way back to the cabin on shaky legs. I knew I should leave, should put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I stood on the porch, looking out at the peaceful forest, I realized I couldn't. Someone needed to stand guard, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. I walked back into the cabin, running my hand along the symbol carved into the log. It no longer filled me with dread. Instead, I felt a sense of purpose. This place, with all its dark history and hidden dangers, was my responsibility now, and I would protect it no matter what came. As I settled into the rocking chair on the porch, rifle across my lap, I smiled for the first time in weeks. I had come to these mountains looking for a new start, a way to rebuild my life. I never expected to find my true calling. I'll never forget that night in 1994, though not for the reasons you might expect. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed at my uncle's old cabin in the woods, deep in the backcountry of eastern Tennessee. The place had stood for generations, passed down through my family, a relic of a time when my ancestors lived off the land. Every year I'd come up for a week to hunt, fish, and just escape from the chaos of my life in Nashville. My name is Jack Hawkins, and I've always considered myself a practical man. At 32, I'd seen my fair share of life's ups and downs, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience in those woods. The drive from Nashville to the cabin was a familiar one, a winding journey through increasingly rural landscapes. As I left the city behind, The sprawling suburbs gave way to farmland, and eventually the dense forests of eastern Tennessee enveloped me. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of leaves, casting dappled shadows on the road ahead. I turned off the main highway onto a narrow dirt road, my old Ford pickup truck bouncing over the uneven terrain. The path was barely wide enough for one vehicle, hemmed in on both sides by thick underbrush and towering trees. As I drove deeper into the woods, the sense of isolation grew. It was both comforting and slightly unnerving, a reminder of just how far I was from civilization. After about an hour on this rough track, I finally caught sight of the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, a weathered structure of rough-hewn logs and a sloping tin roof. The sight of it brought a mix of emotions, nostalgia, relief, and a twinge of something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was because I knew I'd be alone here for the first time in years. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. In the distance, I could hear the faint rushing of the creek that ran near the property. It was mid-October, and the trees were a riot of red, gold, and orange. Leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way to the cabin's front porch. The key was where it had always been, hidden beneath a loose floorboard on the porch. I retrieved it and unlocked the heavy wooden door, which creaked open on rusty hinges. The interior of the cabin was dim and musty, exactly as I remembered it. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, testament to the months that had passed since anyone had last visited. I set about opening the shutters, letting in the fading daylight. The cabin was simple, one main room with a small kitchenette in one corner, a sturdy table with chairs, and a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A ladder led up to a loft where a narrow bed was tucked under the sloping roof. It wasn't much, but it had been a second home to me for as long as I could remember. As I unpacked my supplies and began to settle in, my mind wandered to the reasons that had brought me here. Work had been piling up at the auto repair shop I owned in Nashville. The stress had been mounting for months, a constant pressure that left me feeling drained and irritable. But it was my personal life that had finally pushed me to seek solitude. Rebecca, my girlfriend of 5 years, had left me just 2 weeks ago. The memory of our last conversation still stung. "I can't do this anymore, Jack," she had said, her voice a mix of frustration and resignation. "It's like you're not even here anymore. You're always at the shop, or when you are home, you're a million miles away." I had tried to explain, to make her understand the pressure I was under, but my words fell flat. In the end, she had packed her things and walked out of our apartment, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo through every room. Now, as I stood in the quiet of the cabin, I hoped that this week away would give me the chance to clear my head, to figure out where I had gone wrong and how I could set things right. With a sigh, I pushed these thoughts aside and focused on the tasks at hand. There was work to be done if I wanted to be comfortable for the night. I needed to check the water pump, gather firewood, and make sure the old iron stove was in working order. As I stepped back outside, I noticed the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. The woods seemed to press in closer, the trees standing like silent sentinels at the edge of the property. A cool breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the first hints of the coming night. I shivered slightly, pulling my jacket closer around me. It was going to be a long week, but as I breathed in the crisp autumn air, I felt a sense of anticipation. This was what I needed, time alone with my thoughts, surrounded by the timeless presence of the forest. Little did I know that the peace I sought would soon be shattered, and that this familiar refuge would become the setting for a night that would change my life forever. The next morning I woke to the sound of birdsong filtering through the cabin's thin walls. For a moment I lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, as awareness crept in, I remembered where I was and why I had come. I climbed down from the loft, the old wooden ladder creaking under my weight. The main room was chilly, the fire in the stove having died down to embers overnight. I stoked it back to life, adding a few logs from the pile I had gathered the previous evening. As the cabin slowly warmed, I set about making breakfast. The kitchenette was basic, an old gas stove that I had to light with matches, a few pots and pans hanging from hooks on the wall, and a small icebox that I had filled with perishables upon arrival. I fried up some eggs and bacon, the familiar routine bringing a sense of normalcy to the morning. After breakfast, I decided to explore the surrounding area. It had been a while since my last visit, and I wanted to reacquaint myself with the lay of the land. I grabbed my hunting rifle, more out of habit than any real expectation of using it, and set out into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds and smells of autumn. Leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way along barely visible trails, my boots leaving imprints in the damp earth. Here and there I spotted signs of wildlife, deer tracks in a muddy patch, the distant chattering of squirrels, the flash of a fox's tail as it darted through the underbrush. I hiked for several hours, eventually finding my way to the creek that ran near the property. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I sat on the bank for a while, listening to the soothing sound of the current and trying to clear my mind. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Nashville, to the shop, to Rebecca. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let things slip away from me, that I had been so focused on keeping the business afloat that I had neglected everything else in my life. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I made my way back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I chopped more firewood, cleaned my rifle, and prepared a simple dinner of canned soup heated over the stove. As night fell, I sat on the porch, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the stars emerge in the clear sky above. The next few days followed a similar pattern. I spent my mornings exploring the woods, sometimes with my rifle in hand, hoping to bag some small game. In the afternoons I would fish in the creek, managing to catch a few trout that made for satisfying meals. The solitude began to work its magic. Away from the constant demands of the shop and the painful reminders of my failed relationship, I felt some of the tension begin to ease from my shoulders. The rhythms of life in the woods, waking with the sun, working with my hands, falling asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees, brought a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. But as the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest around me. It was nothing I could put my finger on at first, just a vague feeling that something was off. The woods seemed quieter, the animals more skittish. More than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many days alone. But deep down, a part of me knew that something had changed. The forest that had always been a place of refuge now held an undercurrent of unease, a tension that seemed to grow with each passing day. It was on the third night that things truly began to change, in ways I could never have anticipated. The day had started like any other. I woke early, made breakfast, and set out for a day of fishing. The creek was about a mile from the cabin, a pleasant walk through the autumn woods. As I made my way along the familiar path, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing over the past few days. The forest seemed different somehow. The usual chatter of birds and small animals was muted, as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, a product of too much solitude, but the feeling persisted. I reached the creek around midday. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I set up my fishing gear and settled in for a few hours of quiet contemplation. As I cast my line into the swirling current, my mind wandered back to Nashville, to the life I had left behind. I thought about the auto shop, wondering how my employees were managing without me. I had left my best mechanic Mike in charge, but I knew how quickly things could go wrong in a small business. Then there was Rebecca. Despite the peace I had found in the woods, the ache of her absence was still raw. Lost in thought, I almost missed the tug on my line. I snapped back to attention, reeling in a decent-sized trout. By the time the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I had caught 3 fish, enough for a good dinner and maybe breakfast the next day. As I packed up my gear and prepared to head back to the cabin, I noticed how quickly the light was fading. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more menacing. I picked up my pace, eager to get back before full dark set in. The walk back seemed longer than usual. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own slightly labored breathing. More than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, something I had never felt the need to do before in all my years of visiting the cabin. I set about preparing my dinner, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The familiar tasks of cleaning the fish and stoking the fire in the old iron stove helped to calm my nerves. As the cabin warmed and the smell of cooking fish filled the air, I began to relax. After dinner, I settled into one of the old wooden chairs, sipping a bit of whiskey from my flask. The warmth of the alcohol spread through me, easing some of the tension from the day. That's when I first noticed it, a low hum, barely audible at first, like a vibration in the walls. I stopped, holding my breath, listening intently, but as quickly as it had come, the sound vanished. I shook my head, wondering if the whiskey was playing tricks on my senses. I finished my drink and decided to turn in for the night, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head. As I climbed into the old bed in the loft, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the cabin's shutters. I pulled the blanket over me, but something in the pit of my stomach told me I wasn't alone. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by strange dreams of shapes moving in the darkness and sounds that didn't belong in the woods. It wasn't a noise that woke me, but a sudden sharp feeling of being watched. I lay there still as death, straining to hear something, anything. The hum from earlier was back, louder this time, pulsing through the walls. It sounded unnatural, like it didn't belong in the woods. My heart was racing as I climbed out of bed, reaching for the shotgun I kept propped against the wall. I crept down the stairs, trying not to make a sound. The moonlight seeped in through the cracks in the shutters, casting faint silver lines on the floor. I stood there, shotgun in hand, listening to the humming, waiting for something to happen. And then it stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, and then the door creaked. Slowly, so slowly, like someone or something was pushing it open from the outside. My mouth went dry, my palms sweating as I gripped the shotgun tighter. I aimed at the door, ready for whatever was on the other side, but nothing could have prepared me for what stepped through the doorway. It was huge, hunched over, its back arching like an animal ready to pounce. It moved on all fours, its body covered in thick matted fur like a wild boar, but it was far too large for that. Its head was too wide, its limbs too long and twisted, and I could smell it before I could fully see it, a rancid, sour stench that filled the room. For a moment we both stood frozen, sizing each other up. Then, operating on pure instinct, I squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed through the cabin, the sound ringing in my ears. The thing recoiled, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a snarl, a sound that reminded me of a wild pig caught in a trap, thrashing and angry. Before I could fire again, it lunged at me, knocking the shotgun from my hands. I stumbled back, my body slamming into the table, sending it crashing to the floor. Desperate, I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and swung it as hard as I could. I struck it in the side, but it barely flinched. The creature swiped at me with its claws, catching my arm. The pain shot through me like fire, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, hitting it again and again until it finally backed off. It stood there panting, its massive chest heaving, staring me down with its wide, unblinking gaze. I'd never seen anything like it. The closest thing I could compare it to was a wolf, but it wasn't like any wolf I'd ever seen. It was wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. For a moment we just stood there, staring at each other, both of us waiting for the other to make a move, and then just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the woods. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the poker, my heart racing, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. When I finally worked up the nerve to go outside, the night was still. The woods were quiet again, but this time it felt different. It felt like something was watching me from the trees, hidden just out of sight. Without a second thought, I grabbed my shotgun and the rest of my gear, and I left that cabin without looking back. As I drove through the dark woods, my headlights cutting through the mist that had settled over the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch. It wasn't until I reached the main road, the lights of the nearest town glowing in the distance, that I finally began to relax. But even as the adrenaline faded and the reality of what had happened began to sink in, I knew that my life would never be the same. The world I thought I knew had changed, and I was left with questions that I feared might never be answered. The drive back to Nashville was a blur. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over again. Each time it seemed more unreal, like a vivid nightmare that I couldn't shake off. But the throbbing pain in my arm where the creature had clawed me was a constant reminder that what I had experienced was all too real. I arrived home as the first light of dawn was breaking over the city. My apartment, which had felt empty and oppressive after Rebecca left, now seemed like a sanctuary. I locked the door behind me, drew the curtains, and collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but too wired to sleep. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I examined the wound on my arm, 3 long gashes that had thankfully stopped bleeding but looked angry and inflamed. I cleaned and bandaged them as best I could, my hands shaking the entire time. The next few days passed in a haze. I called the shop and told Mike I needed more time off, citing a family emergency. I couldn't bring myself to go outside, instead spending hours poring over books and websites, searching for any information that might explain what I had seen. Most of what I found was clearly fiction or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But here and there, buried in folklore and local legends, I found stories that resonated with my experience. Tales of creatures in the woods, of things that defied explanation. None of it was conclusive, but it was enough to keep me digging. A week after I returned from the cabin, I finally worked up the courage to call my uncle. He owned the cabin and had been using it for hunting trips longer than I'd been alive. If anyone might know something, it would be him. "Uncle Jim," I said when he picked up, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to talk to you about something that happened at the cabin." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke, his voice was low and serious.
"You saw something, didn't you, Jack?"
I felt a chill run down my spine. "How did you know?" He sighed heavily. "Because you're not the first. Those woods, they're old, Jack. Older than any of us really understand. And there are things out there that we can't explain." Over the next hour, Uncle Jim told me stories that he'd never shared before. Tales passed down through our family of encounters in those woods going back generations. He spoke of shapes seen in the mist, of sounds that couldn't be explained, of hunters who went into the forest and never returned. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked, a mix of anger and fear in my voice. "Would you have believed me?" he replied. "Hell, I didn't believe it myself until I had my own experience out there. Some things you have to see to believe." As we talked, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I wasn't going crazy, that someone else understood what I had been through, but dread at the implications of what Uncle Jim was telling me. If these creatures were real, if they had been out there all this time, what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about the world? In the weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with my new reality. I went back to work, trying to lose myself in the familiar routines of the auto shop. But everything felt different now. The world seemed bigger, stranger, more dangerous. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, scanning the shadows for movement. Even in the heart of the city, far from those Tennessee woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Rebecca called a few times, worried by the strange messages I'd left on her voicemail in the days after my return. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, instead mumbling vague explanations about stress and needing time to think. Our conversations were awkward, stilted, and I could hear the concern and frustration in her voice. As the weeks turned into months, the physical scars from my encounter began to fade, but the mental scars remained, changing me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I became more cautious, more aware of the world around me. I started looking into other unexplained phenomena, spending hours online connecting with others who had experienced things they couldn't explain. I never returned to the cabin after that night. Uncle Jim understood, and he didn't press me on it. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind rustled through the trees outside my apartment, I found myself thinking about those woods, about the creature I had seen, and the questions that still haunted me. What was it? Where had it come from? And most chillingly, was it still out there, waiting in the darkness of those ancient forests? I knew that someday I might have to go back, to face whatever was out there and find the answers I needed. But for now I was content to stay in the city, surrounded by the comforting noise and light of civilization. Yet even here in the heart of Nashville, I couldn't escape the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And sometimes in my dreams, I still hear that low, unnatural hum, feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me, and wake with the lingering scent of those wild, unknowable woods. As months passed, the memory of that night at the cabin never faded. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent. I found myself unable to let it go, driven by a need to understand what had happened to me. This obsession began to seep into every aspect of my life. At the auto shop, I'd catch myself staring out the window, lost in thought about the creature and the mysteries of those woods. More than once Mike had to snap me out of these reveries, concern evident in his eyes. "You okay, boss?" he'd ask, and I'd nod, forcing a smile and diving back into work. But I wasn't okay. The encounter had shaken my understanding of the world to its core, and I couldn't simply go back to my old life. I needed answers. I began my investigation in earnest about 6 months after the incident. I started small, researching local folklore and history. The library became my second home, and I pored over dusty tomes of Tennessee history and Appalachian legends. Most of it was typical stuff: ghost stories, tales of buried treasure, legends of long-lost Native American tribes. But here and there I found nuggets that resonated with my experience. There were stories of wild men in the woods, dating back to the earliest settlers, accounts of hunters encountering creatures they couldn't explain, of strange noises echoing through the valleys on moonless nights. None of it was conclusive, but it was enough to keep me digging. I expanded my search, reaching out to local historians and folklorists. Most dismissed my inquiries as the ravings of another conspiracy theorist or cryptid hunter, but a few were more open-minded, sharing their own stories of unexplained phenomena in the area. One historian, an elderly woman named Margaret Holbrook, proved particularly helpful. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of Nashville, and over coffee she shared stories that had been passed down through her family for generations. "The old-timers," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "They knew there were things in those woods that didn't have names, things that didn't belong in this world. They respected the forest, feared it even. But nowadays people have forgotten. They think they've tamed the wilderness, but they don't understand what's really out there." Margaret introduced me to others who had had similar experiences: hikers who had seen impossible things in the depths of the forest, campers who had been driven from their sites by unexplainable phenomena. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, but the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. As my investigation deepened, so did my obsession. I started neglecting the auto shop, leaving more and more responsibility to Mike. My few remaining friends drifted away, put off by my single-minded focus on what they saw as fairy tales and nonsense. Rebecca tried to reach out a few times, worried by the changes she saw in me. But I couldn't explain to her what I was going through, couldn't make her understand the importance of what I was doing. Eventually her calls stopped coming. It was around this time that I first heard about the Cryptozoological Society of America. They were a fringe group, dismissed by mainstream science, but they were the first organization I'd found that seemed to take these phenomena seriously. I reached out to them, sharing a sanitized version of my experience, and was surprised by their enthusiastic response. They put me in touch with other researchers, people who had devoted their lives to investigating the unexplained. For the first time since that night in the cabin, I felt like I wasn't alone. Through the society I learned of other sightings similar to mine, not just in Tennessee but across the Appalachian region. They had a name for the creature I had encountered: the wood booger, a more sinister cousin of the famous Bigfoot. Armed with this new information and the support of fellow believers, I decided it was time to return to the scene of my encounter. It had been almost a year since that night, and the thought of going back to the cabin filled me with dread. But I knew I had to face my fears if I ever wanted to uncover the truth. I prepared meticulously for the trip, equipping myself with cameras, audio recorders, and other gear recommended by the society. I also brought my old shotgun, more for peace of mind than any real expectation of using it. The drive back to the cabin was tense, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I navigated the familiar roads. As I turned onto the dirt track leading to the property, I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating at the wheel. The cabin looked just as I remembered it, standing silent and weathered in the small clearing. As I stepped out of the truck, I was hit by a wave of memories, both the peaceful times I had spent here over the years and the terror of that one fateful night. I spent the next week camped out at the cabin, dividing my time between investigating the surrounding woods and monitoring my equipment for any sign of paranormal activity. I interviewed locals, hiked to remote areas mentioned in old stories, and spent long nights watching and waiting. For days, nothing happened. The woods were quiet, almost peaceful. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if the stress and isolation had caused me to hallucinate that night a year ago. But on the 6th night, everything changed. I was awoken by that same low hum I had heard before, pulsing through the walls of the cabin. My heart pounding, I grabbed my camera and shotgun and stepped out onto the porch. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, the trees casting long shadows across the ground. And there, at the edge of the woods, I saw it. The creature. It was just as I remembered. Massive, hunched, its matted fur gleaming dully in the moonlight. This time it didn't approach. It stood at the tree line, watching me with those unblinking eyes. I raised my camera with shaking hands, desperate to capture evidence of what I was seeing. Just as I was about to take the picture, a cloud passed over the moon, plunging the clearing into darkness. When the light returned a moment later, the creature was gone. I spent the rest of the night and the following day searching the woods, looking for any trace of the creature. But I found nothing. No footprints, no fur, no physical evidence of any kind. When I returned to Nashville, I was both elated and frustrated. I had seen the creature again, confirming that my original encounter wasn't a hallucination or a dream. But without concrete evidence, I knew that most people would never believe my story. My experiences at the cabin only deepened my resolve to uncover the truth. I threw myself back into my research with renewed vigor, determined to prove the existence of the creature and unravel the mysteries of those ancient woods. As I sit here now, writing this account of my experiences, I'm more convinced than ever that there are things in this world that defy conventional explanation. The creature I encountered, the wood booger as some call it, is real. And it's not alone. There are other mysteries out there, other phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, and I intend to investigate them all. My life has changed irrevocably since that night in the cabin, but I don't regret the path I've chosen, because now I know the truth. The world is far stranger, far more wonderful and terrifying than most people ever realize. And somewhere out there in the depths of those ageless forests, something is waiting, watching. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what it is or where it came from, but I do know one thing: I'll never stop trying to find out. The first thing you should know about me is that I've never been the type to get scared easily. Growing up in Louisiana with all the swamps and wild animals, you kind of get used to weird noises and strange happenings. It toughens you up. That's why what happened in 2004 still doesn't sit right with me. I wasn't the kind of guy to lose sleep over shadows in the woods. My name's Raymond Kellen, and back then I was working as a freelance contractor, the kind that went wherever the money was. I'd built up a reputation for taking on jobs others wouldn't touch, remote locations, difficult terrain, you name it. I'd seen my fair share of strange things in those backwoods places, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the mountains of North Carolina. It was early spring when I got the call. The voice on the other end was gruff, businesslike. He introduced himself as Marcus Harding, a wealthy businessman from Charlotte who'd recently acquired some property up near Boone. He needed someone to restore an old hunting cabin, get it ready for the upcoming season. The pay was good, too good really for what seemed like a straightforward job, but who was I to argue? It's pretty isolated, Harding warned. No cell service, nearest town's about an hour drive. You okay with that? I chuckled. Mr. Harding, I once spent 3 months rebuilding a fire tower in the middle of the Everglades. Isolation's not a problem. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Good, he said finally. There's just one other thing. The cabin, it's got a bit of a history. Local folks tend to avoid it. Superstitious nonsense, you understand, but I thought you should know. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every old building has its stories, especially out in the sticks. As long as the check clears, Mr. Harding, I don't much care about ghost stories. We hammered out the details, and a week later I was loading up my truck for the long drive from Baton Rouge to Boone. It was a journey I'd make many times in my line of work, cutting across the South, watching the flatlands of Louisiana give way to the rolling hills of Mississippi and Alabama, then climbing into the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina. The drive gave me time to think, to plan out the work ahead. From what Harding had told me, the cabin needed a new roof, some structural repairs, and a general overhaul of the interior. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. I figured I could knock it out in a month, maybe 6 weeks tops. As I crossed into North Carolina, the terrain changed. The roads became winding, hugging the sides of mountains that loomed overhead. The forests here were different from the swamps back home, denser, older somehow. There was a stillness to them that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I reached Boone late in the afternoon, stopping to grab supplies and get my bearings. The town was small, quaint in that way mountain towns often are, with a main street lined with local businesses and a scattering of chain stores on the outskirts. I asked around about the Harding property, but most folks just shrugged or changed the subject. It wasn't until I stopped at a local hardware store that I got any real information. The old man behind the counter, his face weathered by years in the mountains, eyed me suspiciously when I mentioned where I was headed. "Harding Place, huh?" he grunted, ringing up my purchases. "That's way out past Shull's Mill. Nasty piece of land if you ask me." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? How so?" The old man glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. "Been empty for years, that cabin. Last family that lived there, well, they didn't last long. Folks say there's something in those woods, something that don't take kindly to visitors." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I appreciate the warning, but I've dealt with my fair share of critters. Bears, mountain lions, you name it." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Ain't talking about no ordinary animals, son. But suit yourself. Just don't go wandering in them woods after dark. And if you hear something calling your name, well, best not to answer." I thanked him for the advice, more amused than concerned. Every small town had its legends, its campfire stories meant to scare outsiders. I'd heard plenty of them over the years, and not once had they amounted to anything more than overactive imaginations and too much moonshine. As I left town, following Harding's directions up into the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest pressed in close on either side of the narrow road, the trees seeming to lean in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The light faded quickly as I climbed higher, shadows deepening in the hollows between the hills. It was full dark by the time I found the turnoff for the Harding property. The road, if you could call it that, was little more than a dirt track winding through the trees. My truck bounced and jolted over exposed roots and rocks, the headlights cutting through the gloom ahead. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I emerged into a small clearing. And there it was, the cabin. Even in the dim light I could see it was in worse shape than I'd expected. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, the windows were mostly broken or boarded up, and the porch sagged ominously. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the sounds of the forest around me. There was something off about the place, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite explain, but I shrugged it off. I had a job to do, and the sooner I got started, the sooner I could get out of there. Grabbing my gear, I set up camp just outside the cabin. The night was cool, a light breeze rustling through the trees. As I unrolled my sleeping bag, I caught a whiff of something unpleasant, a sour, rotten smell that seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. Probably just some animal that had gotten in and died, I thought. I'd deal with it in the morning. As I lay there staring up at the stars peeking through the canopy overhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods seemed too quiet, the usual nighttime sounds of insects and animals strangely absent. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I didn't know it then, but that first night in the clearing would be the last peaceful rest I'd get for a long time. The horrors that awaited me in that cabin and the surrounding woods would change me forever, leaving scars both physical and mental that I carry to this day. But that's getting ahead of the story. To understand what happened in those mountains, you need to know the whole tale, from beginning to end. And trust me, it's not a story for the faint of heart. I woke early the next morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. For a moment I forgot where I was, the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the mountain forest disorienting me. Then it all came flooding back. The job, the cabin, the strange uneasiness I'd felt the night before. Sitting up, I surveyed my surroundings. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less ominous but no less wild. The cabin loomed before me, its weathered boards and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. I could see now that the damage was even more extensive than I'd first thought. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. I made a pot of coffee over my camping stove, the rich aroma helping to clear the fog from my mind. As I sipped the hot brew, I started making mental notes of what needed to be done. First things first, I needed to assess the structural integrity of the place. No point in starting repairs if the whole thing was liable to come down around my ears. Finishing my coffee, I grabbed my toolbox and approached the cabin. The porch creaked ominously under my weight, and I made a note to replace several of the boards. The front door was swollen in its frame, and it took a good shove to get it open. The smell hit me like a physical force. It was the same rotten odor I'd noticed the night before, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. I gagged, covering my nose with my shirt as I stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a mess. Debris littered the floor, fallen chunks of ceiling, broken furniture, and what looked like animal droppings. Cobwebs hung in thick curtains from the rafters, and every surface was coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. But it was the walls that really caught my attention. Deep gouges ran along the wooden planks, some so deep they'd nearly gone clear through. These weren't the random scratches of animals seeking shelter. There was a pattern to them, almost like writing in some alien script. I ran my hand over one of the marks, feeling the splintered wood beneath my fingers. Whatever had done this had been powerful and angry. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment I considered calling Harding and telling him to find someone else for the job. But I shook off the feeling. I'd dealt with bear damage before, and while these marks were unusual, they weren't supernatural. Probably just a particularly aggressive animal that had taken up residence in the abandoned building. I spent the rest of the morning taking measurements and making notes. The roof would need to be completely replaced, as would most of the flooring. The windows were a lost cause, and I'd need to reinforce several of the wall studs. It was a big job, but nothing I couldn't handle. As the day wore on, I found myself relaxing. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. I cleared out the debris, set up a makeshift workbench, and started making a list of supplies I'd need to pick up in town. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something odd. I was outside examining the foundation when I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. It was as if every living thing had suddenly decided to hold its breath. I straightened up, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. For several long moments I stood there, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of what might be causing this unnatural silence. But there was nothing, just the soft whisper of the wind through the leaves and the pounding of my own heart. Slowly, the normal sounds of the forest returned. A bird called in the distance, then another. A squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby tree. Whatever had caused the silence had passed. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself I was being paranoid. But as I went back to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest no longer felt neutral, indifferent to my presence. Now it felt aware, and not in a friendly way. As the sun began to set, I decided to call it a day. I'd made good progress clearing out most of the interior and identifying the major repairs needed. Tomorrow I'd make the trip into town for supplies and maybe ask around a bit more about the history of the place. I heated up some canned stew for dinner, eating it as I sat on the rickety porch steps. The twilight deepened around me, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the clearing. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound echoing mournfully through the hills. I should have been tired after a long day of work, but I found myself reluctant to turn in. There was something about the darkness gathering at the edges of the clearing that made me uneasy. I told myself it was just my imagination, the old man's warnings getting to me, but I couldn't quite convince myself. Finally, as the last light faded from the sky, I crawled into my tent. I left my flashlight on, telling myself it was just so I could find it easily if I needed to get up in the night. But deep down I knew the truth. For the first time in years, I was afraid of the dark. As I lay there listening to the night sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was listening too, waiting, and I had the sinking feeling that sooner or later it would make itself known. Little did I know that moment would come sooner than I could have ever imagined. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a sound. At first I couldn't place it, a low rumbling noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the wind, and it sure as hell wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. I lay there, perfectly still, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. It was a deep guttural noise, almost like something moving heavily through the trees. But there was an odd cadence to it, almost like words, impossible words spoken in a language too old for human tongues. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as I could. But I didn't move, couldn't move. Fear had me paralyzed, pinned to the ground like a butterfly on a collector's board. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, I became aware of a presence outside my tent. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I knew it was there. It was like the air itself had thickened, become charged with a malevolent energy that made every hair on my body stand on end. Something brushed against the side of the tent, not the casual touch of a passing animal, but a deliberate probing movement. I held my breath, willing myself to disappear, to sink into the ground and vanish. Then I heard it, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was my name, spoken in a voice that was somehow both a whisper and a roar, both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. "Raymond," it said, the word stretching out, distorting until it was barely recognizable. "Raymond Kellen." I wanted to scream, to cry out, to do anything but lie there in mute terror. But my voice had deserted me, leaving me helpless as a newborn. The presence moved around the tent, circling slowly. I could hear the grass bending under its weight, could smell a scent like rotting meat and wet fur. It paused at the entrance to the tent, and I knew with sickening certainty that only the thin fabric separated me from whatever nightmare creature lurked outside. "Come out, Raymond," the voice said, and this time I could hear the hunger in it, the ancient, implacable hunger of something that had waited a very long time for a meal. "Come out and play." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a God I hadn't believed in since I was a child. Please, I thought, please let this be a dream. Let me wake up. But I didn't wake up. Instead, I heard a sound like tearing cloth, and suddenly my tent was gone, ripped away like tissue paper. The cool night air hit my face, and I opened my eyes. What I saw in that moment defies description. It was huge, towering over me, its body a twisted mass of fur and scales and things I couldn't even name. Its head was eyeless, but I knew it could see me, knew it was staring right into my soul with a gaze older than time itself. I screamed then, a high, thin sound that didn't even sound human to my own ears. The thing, the monster, opened its mouth, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. It lunged for me, its massive jaws gaping wide, and then I woke up. I sat bolt upright, gasping for air, my heart racing. I was in my tent, which was intact. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of the forest at night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It had been a dream. Just a nightmare, brought on by an unfamiliar place and too many campfire stories. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. The nightmare had left me shaken, its vivid imagery still clinging to the edges of my mind like cobwebs. I told myself it was just a dream, a product of an overactive imagination and the old man's warnings, but a part of me wasn't so sure. I made coffee with shaking hands, the familiar routine helping to ground me in reality. As I sipped the hot brew, I surveyed the clearing. Everything looked normal in the pale morning light, the dilapidated cabin, the surrounding trees, my camping gear. There was no sign of any disturbance, no monstrous footprints or torn vegetation, just the peaceful quiet of an early mountain morning. But as I approached the cabin to continue my work, something caught my eye. There on the weathered wood of the porch were marks, mires, fresh marks that hadn't been there the day before, long deep gouges that ran parallel to each other, as if something with massive claws had raked across the surface. My blood ran cold as I traced the marks with my fingers. They were real, tangible proof that something had been here in the night. Something big and something dangerous. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away, a bear maybe, or some other large predator, but deep down I knew better. These marks matched the ones I'd seen inside the cabin, the ones that had seemed too deliberate, too purposeful to be the work of any normal animal. I spent the morning in a daze, going through the motions of my work but constantly looking over my shoulder, starting at every sound from the surrounding forest. The dream had shaken me more than I wanted to admit, and these new marks, well, they threw everything I thought I knew into question. By midday, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I decided to make the trip into town earlier than planned, hoping to find someone who could shed some light on the history of this place. The drive down the mountain was tense, every bend in the road revealing new shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I found myself pressing the accelerator harder than necessary, eager to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. When I reached Boone, my first stop was the local library. If there was any record of strange happenings around the Harding property, this would be the place to find it. The librarian, a kindly old woman named Margaret, seemed surprised by my interest but was more than happy to help. "The Harding place, you say?" she mused, leading me to a section of local history books. "That land's got quite a reputation around here. Been in the Harding family for generations, but no one's lived there full-time in, must be 50 years now." As she pulled out dusty volumes and faded newspaper clippings, a story began to emerge, a story that made my blood run cold. The land had originally belonged to a Native American tribe who considered it sacred ground, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. When settlers arrived in the area, they forced the tribe out, but not before the tribal elders placed a curse on the land and anyone who dared to dwell there. Over the years, there had been numerous accounts of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, livestock found mutilated, and eerie sounds echoing through the hills at night. The last family to live in the cabin full-time had vanished without a trace in the winter of 1973. Their possessions left behind as if they'd simply walked out one day and never returned. "Some folks say there's something out there in them woods," Margaret said in a hushed voice, her eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "Something old and hungry and patient. It waits, they say, for someone foolish enough to stay too long." I left the library with a stack of photocopied articles and a growing sense of dread. Everything I'd read seemed to confirm my worst fears, that there was indeed something supernatural at work in those mountains, something that defied rational explanation. As I drove back up to the cabin, my mind raced with possibilities. Should I leave now, abandon the job and deal with the consequences? Or should I stay, try to finish the work as quickly as possible, and hope that whatever was out there would leave me alone? In the end, my stubbornness won out. I'd never walked away from a job before, and I wasn't about to start now. Besides, a part of me needed to know the truth, to confront whatever was lurking in those woods and prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. Little did I know that decision would lead me into the darkest, most terrifying night of my life, a night that would change everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. I returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. The golden light made everything look deceptively peaceful, but I knew better now. I could feel eyes on me as I unloaded my truck, watching from the deepening gloom between the trees. I'd picked up some supplies in town, extra flashlights, batteries, and a handheld radio that probably wouldn't work this far out, but made me feel a little less isolated. I'd also bought a shotgun from a local sporting goods store. I told myself it was for protection against bears or mountain lions, but deep down I knew it was for something else entirely. As darkness fell, I barricaded myself inside the cabin. I'd spent the last of the daylight hours boarding up the windows and reinforcing the door. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. I set up my camping lantern in the main room, its warm glow pushing back the shadows but not quite banishing them. For hours, nothing happened. I sat there, shotgun across my lap, jumping at every creak of the old timber and rustle of the wind outside. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that all the stories in my own overactive imagination were getting the better of me. And then, just after midnight, it started. It began as a low rumble, so deep I felt it more than heard it. At first I thought it might be thunder, but the sky had been clear all day. The sound grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once, from the woods, from the ground beneath my feet, from the very air itself. And then I heard my name again, just like in the dream. "Raymond," it called, the word distorted and stretched, barely recognizable as human speech. "Raymond Kellen." I gripped the shotgun tighter, my palms slick with sweat. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" The answer came not in words, but in a series of thuds against the walls of the cabin. Something was circling the building, testing its strength. I could hear wood splintering as whatever it was dug its claws into the old planks. I backed into a corner, shotgun raised, eyes darting from one boarded-up window to another. The attacks grew more frenzied, the whole cabin shaking with the force of them. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and I could hear the roof timbers groaning under some immense weight. And then, for a moment, everything went quiet. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been, filled with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I stood there, hardly daring to move, waiting for whatever would come next. The crash, when it came, was deafening. The roof caved in on one side of the cabin, showering me with debris. And there, framed in the jagged hole, was a sight that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was the creature from my dream, but somehow even more terrifying in reality. Its body was a mass of twisted limbs and matted fur, with scales glinting here and there in the lantern light. Its head was eyeless, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that froze me in place. For a long moment we just stared at each other, man and monster, prey and predator. Then it let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, and lunged for me. I fired the shotgun, the blast deafening in the confined space. The creature reeled back, more surprised than hurt, and I took the opportunity to run. I burst out of the cabin and into the night, heart pounding, legs pumping as fast as they could go. Behind me I could hear the thing giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Trees whipped past me as I ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find someplace safe. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare chase. But eventually, I burst out of the tree line and found myself on the edge of a cliff, a sheer drop of hundreds of feet before me. I turned, gasping for breath, to face my pursuer. The creature emerged from the shadows of the forest, its massive form blocking out the stars. It approached slowly now, almost leisurely, knowing it had me trapped. "Why?" I managed to gasp out. "Why are you doing this?" The thing cocked its head, an almost human gesture that sent chills down my spine. And then, to my shock, it spoke us, not in the distorted, dreamlike voice from before, but in clear, perfect English. "Because this is our land," it said, its voice deep and ancient. "Because your kind have forgotten the old ways, the old bargains. Because the hunger must be fed." It took another step towards me, and I knew with dreadful certainty that this was the end. There was nowhere left to run, no way to fight against this primordial force of nature. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final blow. But it never came. Instead, I heard a sound like tearing fabric, and when I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. In its place was a swirling vortex of darkness, a hole in the very fabric of reality. And from that hole came a wind. Not a natural wind, but something alive, something hungry. I felt myself being pulled towards it, my feet sliding on the rocky ground. I clawed desperately at the earth, trying to find purchase, but it was no use. The vortex grew stronger, the wind howling with the voices of 1,000 lost souls. And then, just as I was about to be sucked in, everything stopped. The vortex collapsed in on itself with a sound like thunder, and I was left alone on the clifftop, the normal sounds of the forest slowly returning around me. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and sobbing. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I finally found the strength to stand. I made my way back to the cabin, half expecting to find it destroyed, but it was intact. No hole in the roof, no claw marks on the walls. The only sign that anything had happened was the shotgun, lying where I dropped it when I fled. I packed up my things in a daze and left that morning, driving away from those cursed mountains as fast as I could. I never returned, never finished the job. I called Harding from the first town I came to and told him I was quitting. He didn't seem surprised. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Was it all a hallucination, a vivid waking nightmare brought on by stress and isolation? Or was it real, a glimpse into a world beyond our own, a confrontation with forces we were never meant to understand? All I know is that I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. In every shadow, every rustle of leaves, I see that creature. And sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear it calling my name. Years have passed since that night in the mountains, but its effects linger. I gave up contracting work, unable to shake the fear that gripped me every time I ventured into remote areas. Instead, I settled in New Orleans, finding work as a carpenter in the city where the comforting sounds of civilization are always within earshot. I've tried to move on, to forget what happened. But on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself back there, running through those dark woods, the creature's roar echoing in my ears. I've researched extensively since then, trying to make sense of what I experienced. I've found similar stories from all over the world, tales of ancient beings that guard forgotten places, of bargains made and broken, of the thin places where our world brushes up against others. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, if I should have tried to understand more about what was happening in those mountains. But then I remember the hunger in that creature's voice, the ancient implacable hunger of something that had waited a very long time for a meal, and I know that running was the only choice I had. I've never spoken publicly about what happened. Who would believe me? But I write this now as a warning. There are places in this world where the old magic still holds sway, where forgotten gods and ancient spirits still walk. If you find yourself in such a place, be careful, be respectful, and if you hear something calling your name in the night, don't answer. As for me, I've made my peace with the fact that I'll never fully understand what happened in those mountains. But I keep a packed bag by my door and a shotgun under my bed, because deep down I know the truth, that the creature let me go that night. And sometimes in my darkest moments I can't shake the feeling that one day it might come to collect what it's owed. But until then I'll keep living, keep working, keep trying to forget. And if you ever find yourself in New Orleans, look me up. I'll buy you a drink and tell you a story about a cabin in the woods, and the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. Just don't ask me to go camping. Some experiences you only need once in a lifetime. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the tranquil lake as we arrived at our familiar camping spot. It was a tradition among our close-knit circle of friends to spend a long weekend here every year, escaping the chaos of our daily lives and immersing ourselves in the serenity of nature. Little did we know that this year's trip would be etched into our memories for all the wrong reasons. The year was 2011, and our chosen campsite was nestled on the edge of a vast lake situated on government land. It was a breathtakingly beautiful area, and during the month of May the water levels would recede, sometimes leaving the lakebed completely exposed. This phenomenon allowed adventurous souls to traverse the expanse on foot, adding an extra layer of excitement to our annual getaway. As long as campers respected the land and refrained from causing disturbances, the authorities permitted overnight stays. It was a haven for those seeking a peaceful retreat, and over the years we had created countless cherished memories here. The campsites were strategically positioned, offering a perfect balance of privacy and community. Each spot was far enough apart to provide a sense of seclusion, yet close enough to foster a spirit of camaraderie among the campers. It was the ideal setting for forging new friendships and strengthening existing bonds. This particular year, our campsite was perched atop a gentle hill, with one site situated below us and another above. As we settled in, blissfully unaware of the impending nightmare that awaited us, we couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement for the days ahead. We arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon, eager to leave the stresses of the week behind and embrace the tranquility of the great outdoors. As we unloaded our gear from the cars, the air was filled with laughter and light-hearted banter. It was a ritual we had perfected over the years, each of us falling into our designated roles with practiced ease. Ben, the unofficial leader of our group, took charge of setting up the tents. His tall, athletic frame made quick work of the task, and soon a small village of colorful shelters dotted the hillside. Lily and Derek, the inseparable couple, busied themselves with organizing the cooking area, their playful teasing and flirtatious glances a testament to their deep affection for one another. As for me, I found myself drawn to the shore of the lake, marveling at the way the sunlight danced across the still surface. There was something about being near the water that always brought me a sense of peace, a welcome respite from the chaos of everyday life. We spent the remainder of the day exploring the surrounding area, hiking the well-worn trails and soaking in the breathtaking vistas. The worries of the world seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound appreciation for the simple pleasures of nature. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, we gathered around the campfire, the flickering flames casting a warm glow over our faces. Laughter and stories flowed as freely as the beer we passed around, each of us savoring the companionship and the sense of belonging that came with being part of this tight-knit group. Little did we know that the tranquility of that first night would be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. The first signs of trouble emerged on the second day of our trip. As we lounged around the campsite nursing the after-effects of the previous night's revelry, we noticed a new group of campers setting up at the site below us. At first, we paid them little attention, too absorbed in our own relaxation to give them much thought. However, as the day wore on and the sun began to sink below the horizon, the newcomers' behavior became increasingly disruptive. Their music blared at an ear-splitting volume, the pounding bass reverberating through the once peaceful woods. Drunken shouts and raucous laughter shattered the tranquility, and a sense of unease began to settle over our group. As the night deepened and the disturbance showed no signs of abating, Ben, ever the peacemaker, decided to take action. With a determined set to his jaw, he made his way down the hill, intent on politely requesting that the rowdy campers turn down their music and keep their voices at a reasonable level. What happened next would forever be seared into our memories. A mere moments after Ben disappeared from view, we heard a shout of pain, followed by the sickening thud of a fist connecting with flesh. Ben stumbled back into our campsite, his hand clutching his face, blood seeping between his fingers. His eyes were wide with shock and anger as he recounted his encounter with the belligerent campers. "They're on drugs," he spat, wincing as he gingerly touched his swelling cheek. "I'm pretty sure of it. They're completely out of control." A palpable tension descended over our group, the carefree atmosphere of just a few hours ago replaced by a growing sense of dread. We huddled closer together, our laughter replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances towards the campsite below. As the night wore on and the music continued to blare, I found myself growing increasingly weary. The events of the day had taken their toll, and I longed for the escape of sleep. Excusing myself from the group, I retreated to my tent, the muffled sounds of the party below fading into the background as I drifted off into an uneasy slumber. I jolted awake to the sound of screams, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to make sense of the chaos erupting outside my tent. Disoriented and groggy, I stumbled out into the night, my eyes widening in horror at the scene before me. Our campsite was in a state of utter pandemonium. Friends were running in every direction, their faces etched with terror. One of them was clutching their chest, a dark stain spreading rapidly across their shirt. Shouts of "Call 911" pierced the night air, mingling with the anguished cries of the wounded. As I stood there frozen in shock, the pieces of the nightmare began to fall into place. In the aftermath of Ben's confrontation with the campers below, Lily and Derek had been making their way back to our site when they crossed paths with our violent neighbors once more. In a tragic case of mistaken identity, the assailants had assumed that Derek was Ben, seeking revenge for their earlier altercation. The attack was brutal and swift. Glass bottles were smashed over Lily and Derek's heads, leaving them dazed and bleeding on the forest floor. But the horror was far from over. As the rest of our group sat around the campfire, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows, 2 or 3 hulking figures emerged from the darkness. They moved with a menacing purpose, their eyes glinting with a feral intensity. In their hands, the glint of steel, a knife and a butcher's cleaver, caught the flickering light of the flames. Ben, ever the protector, rose to confront the intruders. He had barely uttered a word when one of the men lunged forward, plunging the knife deep into his chest. At the same moment, Tim, a camper from the site above who had witnessed the commotion and rushed to our aid, found himself face to face with the man wielding the butcher's knife. In a flash of blinding pain, the blade tore through his stomach, sending him crumpling to the ground. Panic consumed us, a primal fear that overrode all reason. Desperate calls to 911 were met with the grim realization that help was over half an hour away. We were on our own, our lives hanging in the balance. Tim's friends, their faces ashen with fear, loaded him into the back of a car, racing off into the night to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben, though gravely wounded, clung to life, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as we fought to stem the flow of blood from his chest. The attackers, their thirst for violence, seemingly sated, melted back into the shadows, fleeing the scene in a Land Rover. My boyfriend and I, our hearts pounding in our throats, leaped into our own vehicle, speeding towards the entrance of the campground to flag down the approaching police. The night blurred into a surreal haze of flashing lights and barking dogs as the authorities launched a manhunt for the perpetrators. We huddled together, our minds reeling from the horror we had witnessed, praying for the safety of our friends and the swift capture of those responsible. In the days that followed, the true toll of that fateful night began to emerge. Tim, though he had lost a staggering amount of blood, clung to life with a tenacity that astounded the doctors. Ben, his wound less severe, faced a long road to recovery, both physical and emotional. Lily and Derek, their heads bearing the telltale marks of the brutal assault, grappled with the lingering effects of their ordeal. The possibility of a concussion hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the senseless violence that had shattered our peaceful retreat. As for the rest of us, we were left to pick up the pieces of our fractured psyches. The once welcoming woods now held a sinister edge, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a trigger for the memories that haunted our dreams. The legal proceedings that followed were a blur of courtrooms and testimonies, each of us reliving the nightmare in excruciating detail. The attackers, their minds addled by a cocktail of drugs, had been apprehended that very night, their vehicle mired in the muddy lakebed as they sought to flee the scene of their crimes. Justice, though swift, brought little comfort to our battered souls. The scars, both visible and invisible, would take far longer to heal. Years have passed since that fateful camping trip, but the memories of that night remain as vivid as ever. The bond forged in the crucible of shared trauma has proven unbreakable, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. We still gather every year, though our chosen location has changed. The once idyllic lakeside campground now holds too many painful memories, too many reminders of the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men. But we refuse to let fear dictate our lives. We continue to seek out the beauty of the natural world, to find solace in the company of those we hold dear. We have learned through bitter experience that life is a precious gift, one that can be snatched away in the blink of an eye. And so we cherish every moment, every laughter-filled night around the campfire, every breath of crisp mountain air. We hold fast to the love and friendship that sustains us, the unbreakable ties that bind us together. For in the end, it is not the darkness that defines us, but the light we choose to embrace in its wake. It is the strength we find in one another, the courage to face the unknown and emerge unbroken. And though the scars may never fade, we carry them as a badge of honor, a testament to the indomitable spirit that resides within us all. My name is Arthur Jenkins, and I am 71 years old. What I'm about to share with you is a tale that has haunted me for decades. A story that began back in 1987 when I was working as a park ranger in the Bighorn National Forest in Wyoming. It's a vast expanse of wilderness, teeming with wildlife and known for its stunning scenery. I was relatively new to the job, having only been there for a few months, but I loved it. The isolation and tranquility were a welcome change from the noise of the city where I grew up. One crisp morning in early October, I was assigned to check on some remote campsites. We had reports of illegal hunting and suspected poaching activity. The forest was in the thick of hunting season, so we had to be extra vigilant. I packed my gear, grabbed my rifle, standard issue, though I rarely had to use it, and headed out. I started my day at the ranger station, filling out some paperwork and grabbing a quick breakfast. There were 4 of us on duty that day, but we often worked alone. We radioed in our locations periodically just to keep tabs on each other. My first stop was an area known as Whisper Canyon. The name always intrigued me, though I never asked why it was called that. By mid-morning, I had reached the canyon. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I chalked it up to the weather, overcast and chilly, the kind that makes you feel like something's about to happen. I found a few signs of recent activity: a smoldering campfire, discarded beer cans, and some food wrappers. Typical signs of careless campers, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was about to radio in when I heard a rustling in the underbrush. I turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a man, or at least I thought it was a man. He was tall and gaunt, with long matted hair and eyes that seemed too large for his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he wore tattered clothes that looked like they'd been through hell. "Hey you," I called out, trying to sound authoritative. "This is a restricted area. You need to leave." He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me with those unnerving eyes. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively moving to my rifle. I said, "You need to leave." That's when he moved. It was so fast I barely had time to react. One moment he was standing still, and the next he was right in front of me, his hand on my rifle. I struggled to pull away, but he was incredibly strong. We grappled for a moment, but I managed to push him back and get some distance between us. "Get out of here," I shouted, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, just continued to stare at me with that blank expression. I backed away slowly, my rifle trained on him. As soon as I felt I was far enough, I turned and ran back to my truck. I radioed in, breathless, telling the others what had happened. They sent out a team to search the area, but they didn't find anything. No sign of the man, no tracks, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They chalked it up to my imagination, said I was probably just spooked by a hiker or a poacher. But I knew what I saw. That man, or whatever he was real. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those haunting eyes staring back at me. The next day, I went back to the canyon with a couple of my colleagues. We searched the area thoroughly, but again found nothing. I was starting to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I had imagined the whole thing. A few days later, I was out on another patrol when I heard a report over the radio. One of the other rangers, Kevin Harrow, had found something disturbing. I rushed to his location, a remote campsite deep in the forest. When I got there, I saw Kevin standing by the edge of the clearing, looking pale and shaken. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He pointed to a spot on the ground. "There," he said, "look." I walked over and saw what had him so rattled. It was a body, or what was left of one. The remains were scattered as if something or someone had torn it apart. The sight was gruesome, the kind of thing you see in horror movies, not in real life. I felt bile rise in my throat and had to turn away. "We need to call this in," Kevin said, his voice trembling. I nodded and reached for my radio. As I did, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees. It was him, the man from the canyon. He was watching us, his expression as blank and unsettling as before. "Kevin, look," I whispered, pointing towards the figure. But when Kevin turned, the man was gone, vanished again, just like before. We called in the authorities, and soon the area was swarming with police and forensic teams. They identified the body as a local hunter who had been reported missing a week earlier. The cause of death was unclear, but the sheer brutality of the scene left little doubt that it was a violent end. The investigation went on for weeks, but they never found any leads. No one had seen or heard anything unusual, and there were no suspects. The case went cold, and life in the forest returned to its quiet routine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. About a month later, I was on patrol again, this time near a place called Echo Falls. It's a beautiful spot, with cascading waterfalls and lush greenery. I was hoping the serene surroundings would help clear my mind. As I walked along the trail, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see another ranger, but instead I saw him again, the man from the canyon, standing just a few feet away. This time he was closer, and I could see more details. His clothes were even more tattered, his skin more pallid, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were dark, almost black, and seemed to bore into my soul. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just took a step closer. I raised my rifle, but he didn't flinch. "Stay back," I warned, my finger hovering over the trigger. He took another step, and I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. But when the smoke cleared, he was gone. No blood, no body, nothing. It was as if he had never been there. I stood there shaking, my mind racing. Was I going crazy? Had I imagined the whole thing? I radioed in, but I didn't mention the man. I just said I thought I heard something and fired a warning shot. They told me to take a break, said I was probably just stressed. But I knew it was more than that. I was being hunted. Over the next few weeks, I saw him several more times. Always at a distance, always watching. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those dark, soulless eyes. Then one night it all came to a head. I was at home, trying to relax with a beer and some TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I got up to check the locks on the doors and windows, and that's when I saw him, standing in my yard, just beyond the porch light. I grabbed my rifle and ran outside. "Who are you?" I shouted. "What do you want?" He didn't answer, just stood there watching. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, he lunged at me. We grappled, and I felt his cold, clammy hands around my throat. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. Just when I thought I was done for, I heard a gunshot. The man let go of me and staggered back. I turned to see Kevin, my fellow ranger, standing there with his rifle. He had followed me home, worried about me after everything that had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing over to help me up. I nodded, gasping for breath. "I think so. Thank you." We looked around, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no blood, nothing, just like before. Kevin helped me back inside, and we called the authorities. They searched the area but found nothing. After that night, the sightings stopped. I never saw the man again, and life slowly returned to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I left the Ranger Service not long after and moved to a different state, hoping to put the whole thing behind me. Years passed and I tried to forget about that time in the Bighorn National Forest. But every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow or a figure that looked eerily familiar. I'd turn, expecting to see him, but there was never anything there. To this day I don't know who or what that man was. Some kind of spirit, a ghost, or maybe just a very disturbed individual. I may never know, but one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to those woods anytime soon. As I sit here, an old man now, recounting this tale, I can't help but wonder about the nature of reality and the things that lurk just beyond our perception. Was what I experienced real, or was it all in my mind? I've spent countless hours researching similar incidents, looking for any explanation that might make sense of what happened to me. I've learned that the Bighorn National Forest has a rich history of strange occurrences. Native American legends speak of shapeshifters and spirits that roam the wilderness. Early settlers told stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Even today, there are occasional reports of strange sightings and inexplicable events. But none of these stories quite match what I experienced. The man, if he was a man, seemed to exist somewhere between our world and another. He could appear and disappear at will, move with inhuman speed and strength, and leave no trace of his presence. I've often wondered about the hunter we found in the woods. Was he a victim of this entity? Or was there a more mundane, if equally horrifying, explanation for his death? The authorities never solved that case, and I suspect they never will. As for Kevin, my fellow ranger who saved my life that night, we've stayed in touch over the years. He's the only one who truly believes my story, having seen the entity himself. We meet up occasionally, usually over a beer or two, and talk about those strange days in the forest. He's had his own share of unusual experiences since then, though nothing quite as intense as what we went through together. I've never returned to the Bighorn National Forest. The thought of going back fills me with a deep primal fear that I can't quite shake. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I find myself thinking about those vast, silent woods and the secrets they hold. To those who might read this and scoff, dismissing it as the ramblings of an old man or the product of an overactive imagination, I say this: there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. The world is stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine, and sometimes the veil between what we know and what we don't know can be terrifyingly thin. So if you ever find yourself in the wilderness, enjoying the beauty and solitude of nature, remember my story. And if you ever feel like you're being watched, if you ever catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because sometimes the monsters are real, and they're watching, always watching. My name is Charles McDonald, and I'm 63 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened back in 2012, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I was born and raised in the small town of Sandstone, Arizona, nestled in the heart of the Sonoran Desert. Our community is tight-knit where everybody knows everybody, and we look out for each other like family. That's why when my cousin Marcus went missing, it shook us all to the core. It was a Tuesday in late July when Marcus didn't show up for his shift at the local hardware store. Marcus was as reliable as the sunrise. He'd never missed a day of work without calling in. When his boss Jim called me asking if I'd seen him, I knew something was wrong. I immediately drove over to Marcus's small adobe house on the outskirts of town. His pickup truck wasn't in the driveway, and there was no answer when I knocked on the door. I used the spare key he'd given me years ago and went inside. Everything looked normal, no signs of a struggle or hasty departure. His cell phone was on the kitchen counter, its battery dead. My next stop was the home of Sophia, Marcus's girlfriend. She hadn't seen him since Sunday evening when they'd had dinner together. Sophia was worried sick, her dark eyes brimming with tears as she told me about their plans to go camping the following weekend. I spent the rest of the day calling everyone I could think of, but no one had seen Marcus since Monday afternoon. The last confirmed sighting was at the Cactus Creek gas station just outside of Sandstone. The young clerk there, Tommy, remembered Marcus filling up his truck and buying some snacks. He said Marcus seemed fine, maybe a little distracted, but nothing out of the ordinary. By nightfall, we'd filed a missing person report with the Sandstone Police Department. Officer Elena Rodriguez took down all the details, promising to start a search first thing in the morning. But I couldn't just sit and wait. Marcus and I had grown up together, more like brothers than cousins. If he was in trouble, I needed to find him. I woke up before dawn on Wednesday, loaded my old Ford F-150 with supplies: water, food, first aid kit, flashlights, and a couple of blankets. The desert can be unforgiving, and I wanted to be prepared for anything. My first stop was the Cactus Creek gas station. Tommy was there again, bleary-eyed from the early shift. He couldn't add much to what he'd told me yesterday, but he did mention that Marcus had headed west on Route 87 after leaving the station. Route 87 stretches out into the desert like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through an ocean of sand and cacti. I drove slowly, scanning the sides of the road for any sign of Marcus's truck or any skid marks that might indicate he'd gone off the road. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, baking the earth below. I checked every turnoff, every little side road that branched away from the highway. The vastness of the desert was overwhelming. Marcus could be anywhere out here. It was late afternoon when I spotted something that made my heart skip a beat. About a mile off the main road, barely visible behind a cluster of saguaro cacti, was the rusted shell of an old building. As I got closer, I realized it was an abandoned trading post, a relic from a time when this area was more populated. Something about the place felt off. The air seemed thicker, heavier somehow. I parked my truck and called out Marcus's name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice bouncing off the decaying walls of the trading post. The trading post must have been abandoned for decades. Its windows were broken, sand had piled up against the walls, and there was a musty smell of decay that hit me as soon as I stepped inside. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as I made my way through the building. The front room was littered with debris, old newspapers, broken furniture, and empty cans left behind by squatters or adventurous teenagers. I moved carefully, aware of every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. In what must have been the back office, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hanging on a rusty nail was a jacket, Marcus's jacket. I recognized it immediately. I'd given it to him for his birthday last year. It was torn in several places, and there were dark stains that looked horribly like dried blood. With shaking hands, I took the jacket off the nail. There was no doubt in my mind now that Marcus had been here, and he'd been in some kind of trouble. I needed to get back to town, to show this to the police. But as I stepped out of the trading post, something caught my eye. Footprints. Fresh ones, leading away from the building and deeper into the desert. They weren't Marcus's. I knew his boot prints well from our hunting trips. These were different, longer, and narrower than any human foot I'd ever seen. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Every instinct told me to get in my truck and drive back to Sandstone. But I couldn't leave, not when I might be close to finding Marcus. I grabbed a bottle of water, my flashlight, and a small first aid kit from the truck. Then, against my better judgment, I started following the strange footprints into the gathering darkness. The footprints led me to the mouth of a narrow canyon, a deep gash in the earth that wasn't visible from the road. The walls rose high on either side, blocking out what little daylight remained. I hesitated at the entrance, the beam of my flashlight seeming feeble against the encroaching darkness. "Marcus," I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. There was no response, but I thought I heard something, a faint rustling sound, like fabric moving against stone. I entered the canyon, moving slowly, my senses on high alert. The air grew cooler as I went deeper, and the silence was oppressive. The only sounds were my own footsteps and ragged breathing. The canyon twisted and turned, and I lost track of how far I'd gone or how long I'd been walking. The footprints I'd been following had disappeared, erased by the wind that whistled through the narrow passageway. Just as I was about to turn back, convinced I'd made a terrible mistake, I heard it again, that rustling sound, closer this time. And then, so faint I almost missed it, a muffled cry for help. "Marcus," I shouted, breaking into a run. "Marcus, where are you?" The canyon opened up into a small circular area, like a natural amphitheater. My flashlight beam swept across the space, and that's when I saw him. Marcus was propped up against the far wall, his hands and feet bound with what looked like old rope. His face was bruised, his clothes torn and dirty. I rushed to him, my heart pounding. Marcus, oh God, Marcus, what happened to you? His eyes flickered open, unfocused at first, then widening in recognition. Charles. His voice was barely a whisper. How? Never mind that, I said, working to untie the ropes. We need to get you out of here. Can you walk? Marcus nodded weakly. As I helped him to his feet, he swayed, nearly collapsing. He was dehydrated and exhausted, but alive. Who did this to you? I asked as we started making our way back through the canyon. Was it robbers? Drug smugglers? Marcus shook his head, his eyes wild with fear. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Charles. It wasn't human. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. I wanted to press him for more information, but getting him to safety was the priority. We moved as quickly as we could through the twisting passages of the canyon, Marcus leaning heavily on me. We were nearly at the entrance when I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I turned, shining my flashlight back the way we'd come. There, at the edge of the light's reach, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, almost skeletal. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the flashlight's beam. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They glowed faintly in the dark, 2 pinpricks of eerie yellowish light. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching us. Marcus let out a whimper of fear, and that broke the spell. I half-carried, half-dragged him out of the canyon and to my truck. I didn't look back, didn't stop until we were speeding down Route 87 back towards Sandstone. The next few days passed in a blur. I took Marcus straight to Sandstone General Hospital, where he was treated for dehydration, malnutrition, and various cuts and bruises. The doctors were amazed he'd survived 3 days in the desert heat with little water. Officer Rodriguez came to take Marcus's statement, but he was still too shaken to give a coherent account of what had happened. I told her about finding the jacket at the trading post and discovering Marcus in the canyon, but I left out the part about the creature. I wasn't sure I believed it myself, and I didn't want the police to think we were both crazy. As Marcus recovered, he told me more about his ordeal. He'd stopped at the trading post out of curiosity, thinking he might find some interesting old artifacts. That's when the creature attacked him. Marcus described it as moving with incredible speed and strength, overpowering him before he could even cry out for help. The creature had dragged him into the canyon, keeping him tied up and barely alive. Marcus couldn't explain why it hadn't killed him outright. It was like it was studying me, he said, shuddering at the memory. The police organized a search of the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of habitation in the canyon or the trading post. They concluded that Marcus had probably been attacked by a mountain lion or a particularly aggressive coyote, and that dehydration and fear had caused him to hallucinate the more fantastic elements of his story. But I knew what I had seen. That thing in the canyon was no animal. At least not any animal known to science. Life in Sandstone slowly returned to normal, but things were never quite the same. Marcus moved away a few months later, saying he couldn't stand being so close to where it had happened. I understood. The memory of that night haunted my dreams, and I hadn't even experienced the full brunt of the attack. As time passed, the events of that summer faded into local legend. People would sometimes talk about the thing in Dead Man's Canyon over beers at the Dusty Cactus Saloon, but it was always with a nervous laugh, a way of scaring themselves for fun. I stayed in Sandstone, taking on more responsibilities in the community. I became something of an unofficial protector, always keeping an ear out for any strange occurrences, especially in the desert. I warned people away from the old trading post in the canyon, spinning yarns about unstable structures and treacherous terrain. Most listened, but there were always thrill-seekers looking for adventure. It was 5 years after Marcus's disappearance when it happened again. A young woman named Lily Chen, a geology student from the University of Arizona, went missing while doing field research in the area. The similarities to Marcus's case were striking. Her car was found near the old trading post, and she'd last been seen at the Cactus Creek gas station. I joined the search party, my heart heavy with dread. We combed the desert for days but found no trace of Lily. As we were about to give up, I heard a familiar rustling sound coming from the direction of the canyon. Without thinking, I broke away from the group and ran towards the sound. I found Lily in almost the exact same spot where I'd found Marcus years ago. She was in better shape. It had only been 3 days, but her eyes held the same haunted look I'd seen in my cousin's. As I untied her, I heard it again. That soft rustling, like fabric against stone. I turned, and there it was, watching us from the shadows. The creature hadn't changed at all in 5 years. Its pale, gaunt form and glowing eyes were exactly as I remembered. This time, I didn't run. "What are you?" I called out, my voice echoing in the canyon. "What do you want from us?" The creature tilted its head, an almost human gesture of curiosity. For a moment I thought it might speak, but then it simply melted back into the shadows, leaving Lily and me alone in the eerie silence of the canyon. Lily's rescue brought the events of 5 years ago back into sharp focus for Sandstone. This time there were 2 witnesses to the creature's existence. The authorities could no longer dismiss it as the ravings of a dehydrated mind. A team of scientists and researchers descended on our little town, eager to investigate the phenomenon. They set up camp near the canyon, armed with all sorts of high-tech equipment to detect and possibly capture the creature. Weeks passed with no sign of the entity. The scientists grew frustrated, some openly questioning Lily's and my accounts. But I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. It was a moonless night when it finally showed itself again. I was at the research camp, talking with Dr. Sarah Thompson, the lead scientist, when all their equipment went haywire. Alarms blared, lights flashed, and in the chaos we saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the camp, its pale form illuminated by the floodlights. In the clear light we could see details that had been obscured in the darkness of the canyon. Its skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, with a network of veins visible beneath the surface. Its eyes, those eerie glowing orbs, were oversized and seemed to take in everything at once. Dr. Thompson gasped beside me. "It's not of this earth," she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and awe. The creature took a step forward, and everyone in the camp froze. Then, to our utter amazement, it began to change. Its form shimmered and shifted, becoming more humanoid. In a matter of seconds it had transformed into an exact replica of me. A voice echoed in my mind, and from the reactions of those around me, I knew they could hear it too. "We mean you no harm," the voice said, using my vocal cords but with an otherworldly resonance. "We are travelers, explorers from a world far beyond your own. We came to study, to learn, to understand." Questions flooded my mind. Why had they taken Marcus and Lily? Why hide for so long? The answers came as quickly as the questions formed. "We did not understand your fragility at first," the voice continued. "We sought to study you closely, but our methods were imperfect. We have learned much since then, about your physicality, your emotions, your capacity for both fear and wonder." Dr. Thompson found her voice. "Why reveal yourselves now? Why to us?" The creature, still wearing my form, turned its gaze to her. "Your species stands on the brink of a great leap. Soon you will venture out among the stars in earnest. We needed to understand you, to determine if you were ready for the wonders and terrors that await you in the vast expanses of space." "And are we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are we ready?" A smile played across the familiar yet alien face. "That remains to be seen. But you have potential, Charles MacDonald. All of you do. We will be watching your progress with great interest." With that, the creature's form shimmered once more, returning to its original, otherworldly appearance. Then, in a flash of light that left us all blinking and disoriented, it vanished. In the years that followed, Sandstone became famous. Scientists, researchers, and curiosity seekers flocked to our little town, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the desert's otherworldly visitor. Some claimed to see strange lights in the sky or odd shapes moving in the shadows of the canyon. But the creature, or creatures, never revealed themselves so openly again. Marcus returned to Sandstone, no longer afraid but fascinated by what he'd experienced. Lily Chen completed her geology degree and became a leading researcher in the new field of xenogeology, the study of